On January 7th, 1970, Swedish cross-country skiers Aarno, Heinonen, and Esko Viljo were out training in the woods of Imjärvi, Finland for an upcoming competition. Aarno was 36 years old at the time and working as a woodman, while Esko was aged 38 and worked as a farmer. Both men lived simple lives. However, that day, they would have one of the strangest alien encounters in the history of Finland. The incident produced adverse health effects in both men and was considered to be quite credible early on. However, one of the men, Aarno, alleged to have continued contact with the beings, which led many to cast doubt on the original story. In this episode, we will explore this unbelievable 1970 alien encounter that happened in the city of Imjärvi, Finland. Around 4:45 in the afternoon, as the sun was setting, after cross-country skiing for most of the day, the two Finnish skiers decided to stop in a clearing and rest. The day was extremely cold, with complete visibility in the sky, and the two men were looking forward to wrapping up their training session and heading home. After about 5 minutes of standing in the clearing, the men began to hear a faint buzzing sound. They looked up to the north and saw a light which was moving toward them, and soon it began descending. As the light came closer and closer to the ground, soon the men saw that the light was surrounded by a reddish-grayish cloud. As the craft came down to about 50 feet, they noticed that inside the cloud sat some sort of craft or object. It was around 10 feet long and had a dome on top, appearing to be composed of some type of metal. The craft then began to hover over them while continuing to descend, and the men could now see the underside. There was a short tube protruding out from the center. Interestingly, the tube was very small, being only about 10 inches round. As the craft kept coming lower, the gray-reddish mist dissipated and the buzzing sound turned down to a faint noise. At this point, the craft was only around 10 to 12 feet above the men. Then, an extremely bright light shot down from the craft. The light lit up the snow and seemed to blacken the edges of it somehow. The light spread out as it descended and appeared to be around 2 feet in diameter on the surface. The two men were stunned, speechless, and not saying a word to one another during this time. Still, it's important to note they didn't appear to be scared. Then inside the light, a creature would suddenly appear. Neither man saw the being descend from the light, but rather just suddenly become visible. The being was quite small and thin, being shorter than 3 feet. It had on green overalls and also darker green boots. The being appeared to have a hooked nose and also was wearing some type of coned helmet. Neither man seemed to be able to recall the eyes, which are somewhat odd. This could be due to the bright light obscuring it somehow though. The creature was carrying some type of black box. There was some sort of bright yellow light coming out of it that was flashing. Initially, the light was shining between the two men and not hitting them directly. Then the being turned slightly, and the bright light hit Aarno. At that time, a gray mist floated down into the forest, and something that appeared as sparks began flying from the area in the snow where the light was. The sparks, which were multicolored, hit the men, and soon the gray-red smoke was so thick that the men couldn't see the being or even each other. Then suddenly the men saw the white light from the craft shoot up, and both the light and the being disappeared. At the same time, the smoke vanished, along with the craft. The men were surprised by the events, but unlike most, they reported they weren't that scared. They were even telling some jokes during the event. However, they would soon come to realize this wasn't a laughing matter. Immediately after the craft vanished, both men experienced damaging physical effects. Aarno tried to walk, but his leg was so numb that he fell in the snow. He recalled his right leg just gave out, since that probably had the most contact with the light. Aarno was forced to sit down. Esko initially thought this was a joke, but soon came to realize that Aarno was serious. Esko was forced to drag his friend down the rest of the mountain. They went around 3 kilometers and arrived at Aarno's mom's house. She would later recall the men looked like they were in bad shape, but not really scared. Esko's face was red and swollen. Aarno was in much worse shape though. His back was hurting as well as his joints. He soon was vomiting and his urine turned black. Things would only get worse for Aarno though. He was treated by a doctor, but even after 10 days the symptoms remained. He couldn't work, was extremely lethargic, had trouble balancing, and began having problems with his memory too. Dr. Polly Kajanajo, who examined Aarno, couldn't explain the black urine. He thought it could be blood in the urine, but he stated that that wouldn't last for months like Aarno experienced. Esko would have adverse health effects too. He had issues with his eyes and headaches for days after the event and saw Dr. Kajanajo. Dr. Kajanajo thought the men could have been exposed to something radioactive. While the men made some incredible claims, there were reports of others seeing strange lights in the area that night as well. Elna Stellari, who worked on a farm around 10 kilometers away, reported seeing a strange light. Also, a boy in Paso reported seeing an odd light too. In June of 1970, the 2 men would revisit the site with the journalist. Oddly, when the men and the journalist arrived, the hands of all 3 began to turn red and swelled up. Aarno would report getting a crippling headache as well. While the initial sighting was deemed pretty credible by ufologists, subsequent claims by Aarno would come to damage the credibility of the case. After the initial sighting, Aarno would claim to have been visited by the beings at least 23 more times. Aarno has a number of incredible stories from his encounters, many of which seem outlandish. For example, on one encounter, Aarno alleged he heard a female voice telepathically guide him to a secluded spot in the woods. There, he would meet a gorgeous woman, or what looked like a woman. She was around 5 feet tall, had blonde hair cropped to her shoulders, and blue eyes. The being hovered or floated over to Aarno, communicating with him in Finnish. She told him she was 180 years old, although she looked 20. She went on to tell him that he had met several different types of aliens from her planet. Aarno would claim to speak with the woman one more time. On his second meeting, Aarno attempted to photograph her, and according to Aarno, she disappeared right as the photo snapped. He also alleged he tried to take a photo of the craft, but as he was raising his camera, it flew out of his hands. Aarno's accounts of his interactions and subsequent events have led many ufologists to doubt his story. Without question, the later events have hurt his credibility. For example, Aarno alleges to have received a green pen from the beings, but then says he misplaced it. Also, the reports around the cameras have led many to cast doubt on his story. This has led some to believe the initial story was true, but the effects experienced by the initial encounter have damaged him psychologically. Some speculate this has led to delusions and hallucinations. Still, while many of Aarno's later claims sound like fiction, the initial encounter does appear to have some credible elements. 1. Both men experienced severe adverse health effects for quite some time. These were cross-country skiers in peak condition, and the event left them in a very fragile state. It seems unlikely they would be able to fabricate this. In addition, there were 2 witnesses, and both their stories were extremely similar. It's important to point out too that it's possible Aarno was telling the truth about the later events. Many of the stories have elements similar to other alien encounters, such as telepathic communication and beings that appear attractive. Could it be the case Aarno liked the attention from the initial encounter and fabricated the later stories? It's surely a possibility. Unfortunately for Aarno and Esko though, evidence for these close encounters of the third kind in the UFO community is based almost primarily on witness credibility, and after Aarno told his later stories, he lost almost all the credibility he first had.